starting across this field. You today are 215. So you are 1/4 of the entire Texas Brigade that came across this field 150 years ago. 811 men. And among the troops, they knew that they were going into a direful circumstance, but they had the perception among at least some of them that they had just saved the life of Robert Edward Lee, and now their task was to save the life of the Army. And they threw themselves right into the heart of this mix where we're located now. As the Texas Brigade angled into this corner of the field, their first contact with their enemy is directly in front of you and to the right of the road. The Confederates who hit this spot hit with a tremendous amount of fury. According to Robert Campbell, one of the Texans, we reached the undergrowth and entered it with a yell, and in less than 100 yards came face to face with the advancing, triumphant, and sanguine foe. And here only a few brave souls could dare to fire or yield their ground. In fact, he went on to say that the enemy are at least 5 or 6 to 1 of us, and death seemed to be our portion. With only 15 or 20 paces separating us, the contest waxed hotter and deadlier, and we gave cheer and tried to charge. But with our handful of men, our only success was to rush up to them, shoot them down, and shove them back about 10 or 15 yards. So we are toe-to-toe in a massive combat of life and death immediately in our presence. According to one of the staff officers, for 25 minutes, we held them steady at this place. Not a foot did they advance, and at the expiration of that time, more than half of our brave fellows lay around us dead and dying and wounded. According to one of the Union staff officers, he came to pretty much the same conclusion about this Texas Brigade. He said the onset of Gregg's Texans was savage. As they met face to face with only 15 paces between them and blasted away into each other's faces, feeling literally the burn coming off of each other's fire, they not only are taking fire from the front, but they're taking fire from the flank. Remember that the Federals had made a deep incursion, and even if Kershaw's men had met them and pushed them back, we have gone into a pocket of the Union forces where they can fire across, and the losses are extreme up and down this line. General Gregg was to be seen everywhere. According to one of his men, the general, whose manly form was seen wherever danger gloried most. And he ought to know because he was one of the staff officers that had to follow him. He wasn't all that excited about it. He admitted that when everything was said and done, 2 staff officers had been sent away to get ordnance, to get more ammunition for the men who are blasting away furiously at this spot. Outside of that person, or outside of the 2 that had been left, the one that was the writer is the only staff officer that wasn't shot. Everybody else was lost because they were next to the general that drew so much fire. General Gregg was never shot. He came through this without a scratch. But the same could not be said for his staff or his horses. The general had 3 horses shot out from under him here. The last horse took 5 mortal wounds and still managed to stagger and keep him on the field until the fighting had abated before it collapsed and died in this field. This is just indicative of everything that is surrounding us. John Gregg's division commander is a man named Charles Field. Charles Field had lost a leg early in the war and has hobbled back into the war in 1864, entering into this field under Robert E. Lee for the first time in almost 2 years. And he gets himself shot twice trying to get into this field. a division commander. Fortunately for him, they were slight wounds, and he was able to, despite them, retain his command and stay on the field. As the day would go on, that would become vitally important. The Texans themselves took extreme losses. The far right was the 5th Texas, followed by the 4th Texas, 1st Texas, and then out on the left was the 3rd Arkansas Infantry. But in a Texas brigade, that could be a little bit confusing, so they made them honorary Texans. Today, they earned that. In fact, they had earned it many, many times over. But today, they consummated, all of them consummate what it means to be in the Texas Brigade. The 5th Texas Infantry on the far right that got caught in the crossfire, they lost their entire hierarchy. They lost their commanding officer, a colonel named King Brian. King is his nickname. His real name is Kendalia. So it's easy to understand why he would prefer to be called King. King Brian is going to be killed. His acting lieutenant colonel is a mere captain, T.T. Clay, who was severely wounded. Their acting major is Captain D.C. Farmer. He goes down. The adjutant of their regiment, W.P. McGowan, all of them wounded. All of them taken out. This regiment has no leadership left intact. 3rd Arkansas on the other end of the line, as far away from this crossfire as you can get, but keep in mind, when you're only 800 men, you don't have a long front. A crossfire extends across the entire length of it. They lost their commanding officer too, also with a perfectly acceptable name, Vanoy Hartrog Manning. He preferred to go by Van. So Van Manning, he is going to be lost in this particular time. He himself had been wounded at the Battle of Sharpsburg in 1862, had come back into the war only to be shot now through the thigh, and he was so close to the front that he was actually captured and taken into federal lines. He would not be released until July of 1865. So those who can walk off this field and stay with their troops, some of them are going to persevere to Appomattox, and that's April. But those that get captured, their war is longer than that. Eventually he managed to survive this, even though he was one of the immortal 600. Afterwards, he became a lawyer and a U.S. congressman and a D.C. lawyer, and died in Maryland well after the war and is buried in Washington, D.C. So a man who is fighting against Washington, D.C. is also going to become part of Washington, D.C. in the post-war America, in a different type of America than what we were looking at in 1864. Van Manning came into this with 10 officers. He was already missing 2. Only 2 officers will walk away this day. Everybody else was gone. Among the wounded and those who are hurt out here, the common soldiers are the ones that we often forget. We focus in on these commanding officers because they're indicative, they're indicators of the losses underneath them, because they have a certain element of being more bulletproof. But in fact, they're just like everyone else. And the men who suffer under them, while we don't know many of their stories, those that we see, those that we hear, are truly amazing. One particular man, a member of the 5th Texas Infantry, who was probably very close to exactly where we're standing right now, was a man named George J. Robinson. And when he came charging into this little corner right in front of this patch of woods, he was shot in the face. The bullet passed through both cheeks, according to a person who was recounting this, and it nearly severed off his tongue and shattered his jaw. He lived to tell about it. Or rather, he just lived, because he could never tell about it. The big ramification in his world, it was impossible for him to take food in solid form for the rest of his life because of a brief moment of standing right here. A member of the 1st Texas, Willis Watts, Company D. He had a mortal aversion to mini balls. But he has a right to that mortal aversion. The last battle he was in was at the Battle of Chickamauga. He was wounded 3 times in that battle. And yet, after that September 1863 battle, he had recuperated, he had recovered, and returned to action today, where he was wounded 3 more times where we are standing. This man was wounded 6 times in 9 months. He never wanted to see a mini ball after that. So 811 men come here. I've only told you about a couple of them. Those men are indicative of everything that transpires around us. 811 men get to this spot. 565 of them are going to go down at this spot. 811, 565 of them are going to go down. That means only 200 plus men are going to walk away from this encounter. Look at yourselves. You were 1/4 of Hood's Texas Brigade. 1/4. And yet, all of you would have been the only survivors to walk away from this intact, whole, body unaltered. This is all that is left. So look at yourselves. When you started this walk a couple of hours ago, you didn't make the numbers of a decent regiment. But when you leave here today, you are the size of an entire brigade. You are the size of Hood's Texas Brigade. Hood's Texas Brigade, now Gregg's Texas Brigade, 565 men lost here. They lost 69.7% of their force. 69.7%. We hear of units being decimated on the battlefield. But these men were not decimated, because deci is 10. 10% losses are decimated. These men were annihilated. They were obliterated. They were eliminated. And they would no longer be a brigade in strength. They would be a brigade in name. And they had cast their lot here. This is where they made their impression. This is where they made that difference, where they bought the time with a blood sacrifice that other troops might come here and take the battle to their enemy. They threw themselves into the midst of a crisis. They were consumed by that crisis, but they consumed the crisis itself and allowed this battle to flow onward and continue. There will be other units coming in here. As you heard Eric talking about Alabamans and Robert E. Lee engaging them. These Texans have bought the time for those men to get engaged, to come forward. And as we have Georgian brigades starting to move past us, Henry Rock Benning's brigade is going to go out there. Benning is going to get himself severely wounded for his effort and have to be carried off this field. But he will buy the necessary time that is started by the Texans, carried on by the Georgians, and now Alabamans will also be engaged in coming across this field. As we heard that as Lee had said, hurrah for Texas, he had said, hurrah for the Alabamans. We know that Robert E. Lee cut an amazing figure here, this day, this time, this hour, in 1864, as he met the crisis himself personally, and where he had been frustrated and flustered, and the crisis seemed to rule him and his emotions. He had now not only stabilized the situation, he had also regained and recaptured his equilibrium. And as Alabamans came across this field, they met with their general officer, and he was a true inspiration. According to one of the colonels from the 15th Alabama, I thought him at that moment the grandest specimen of manhood I ever beheld. He looked as though he ought to have been and was the monarch of the world. So what's that mean? Is that just hyperbole? Is that trying to capture a moment and put a fine patina on it? But in fact, it does have ramifications. Another Alabama, William Perry, said to look at him, he was a lion. And it was impossible not to feel that every man that passed him was, for the time being, a hero. It was important in what he was doing. It was calculated, because what Robert E. Lee does to show self-possession creates a self-possession among his men, a presence, a communion of the thought and minds of the soldier. If the commanding officer is calm, the men will be calm. The men reflect their leadership. And Robert E. Lee, to command men, must first command himself. And that's what he does at this time, at this moment. As we have gone from where A.P. Hill's line was, all the way across the Widow Tapp's field. And in the course of that journey, we have gone the full gamut of great expectations of taking the battle to the enemy, to going to the brink of disaster. And now we are back again on this side of the field, where again, momentum has shifted. The balance has shifted. And Robert E. Lee is no longer facing the gravest crisis of his life as it starts to abate, but now starts thinking in broader and bigger terms about the overall battle.
That was the pocket of my jacket. I just wanted to say some final words here before we break. We figured we'd break here since there are some monuments and things to see, and then you can all make your way back to your vehicles on your own. But where we're standing is, as Frank described and explained, the contribution and the sacrifice of Greg's Texas Brigade here. A tribute to that contribution, to that sacrifice, is directly behind us in many forms. Directly behind us here, behind the group, this is where the Texans were buried. Those that fell here in the fighting. Apparently collected and placed here. A member of the 4th Texas, Joseph Pauley, he visited here only 6 days later, May 12, 1864. When the fighting is going on to the south at the Bloody Angle, Pauley was up here. He was not with his regiment. He was up here, and he returned here to this location, and he said that the bodies of our Texas boys, brave fellows all, who had fallen, had been gathered together and buried under a large tree by the side of the plank road. Although one large opening in the earth received them, at the head of each was placed a board with his name crudely carved on it, while nailed to a tree nearer was another board on which were carved the simple but eloquent words, "Texas dead." Behind us here, there are depressions in the ground, linear depressions that are in a row. Those are the remnants of the graves of the Texans. Immediately after the war, in 1866, James Horace Lacey, who of course lived at Elwood but owns the Tapp farm, he created a list of all of the identifiable burials on his property, both at Elwood and here on the Tapp farm, and he identified 31 graves of Texans who were here buried on his Tapp property right behind us. Those bodies, those remains were removed, and they were moved into the Fredericksburg City Cemetery in what became the Fredericksburg Confederate Cemetery. So the depressions behind us, those are the remnants of the grave shafts. The bodies have been removed and are in Fredericksburg, but those depressions are the grave shafts. In 1891, perhaps by Lacey, a quartz boulder was placed here to mark the location. The boulder has tipped over many years ago. It was initially erected, has fallen over, but the quartz boulder was an early effort. In fact, the Richmond Times wrote of the erection of this quartz boulder, said that it was in commemoration of their heroism and devotion to General Lee shown by the Texas Brigade. This stone was erected. So the quartz boulder was put up at that time to the Texans and to Robert E. Lee. In 1903, the granite marker that we have out on the road here, 1903, James Power Smith, who was one of Stonewall Jackson's staff officers, also married into the Lacey family. Smith had that monument erected, along with many others that are in the Fredericksburg area, and that one says, "Lee to the rear, cried the Texans." So 1903, they're commemorating this event here, the sacrifice of the Texans, as well as that interaction with Robert E. Lee. The Texas Monument behind us, the pink granite monument, that went up in 1963 and also commemorates the Texans here. But looking at, again, this event, the Texas Brigade attacking, Lee's interaction and involvement here, as I said, as we've talked about, it looms large in the memory, not only of the Texans, but within the Confederate history as well. Rumors of Lee's proximity to danger here on May 6th spread throughout the Army. Post-war, the event has become a primary story and legend of the old Confederacy. There are at least 4 poems and 1 song that were written shortly after the Civil War about the charge of the Texas Brigade and about Lee, the Lee to the rear episode. A Confederate veteran created a large painting of Lee to the rear with the Texans that was hung in the Texas state capitol for many years until it burned in 1891 or 1881. In literature, this event looms large. John W. Thomason, who was a combat veteran, officer, World War I, Marine Corps legend, historian, author, artist, and a grandson of one of Longstreet's staff officers. He grew up in Huntsville, Texas, and listened to the tales told by the veterans of the Texas Brigade. He authored a novel that was serialized in the Saturday Evening Post from 1938 to 1940, entitled Lone Star Preacher. It's a work of fiction. It's about a fighting chaplain in the Texas Brigade, a fellow named Praxiteles Swan. And the fighting chaplain, a work of fiction, but Thomason drew upon those conversations and what he heard with the veterans as a child. In this novel, he talks about how Swan goes to a veterans reunion after the war. And he's there talking with other veterans of the Texas Brigade, and a man is explaining how he was the man who grabbed Lee's reins and led him to the rear. And he turned to Swan and he asked him, "You were there, verify this." And this is what Thomason said. He said, his character Swan replied, "I have stood flat-footed on the streets of Houston these 25 years and heard 40,000 men tell me, each of them personally, that he was the fellow who grabbed Traveler's bits and turned General Lee around at the Battle of the Wilderness. Now you tell me it was you. All right, tell me one more thing. If there were so many of you in the wilderness that morning, why in the name of the blessed Redeemer didn't you all drive Grant back across the Rapidan and win the war?" So this connection with Lee in the event here was very much a source of pride after the war. But if we look at Lee and the interaction, the Lee to the rear episode, what does it mean? What was actually occurring here? Lee was urging, he was emotional, he's pushing forth, he's the commander of this army, he's showing himself, he's putting himself in harm's way, something he had yet to do, or needed to do during the war. Be right there on the front line, urging, following his men into battle. Was it a sign of desperation? Certainly, on this end of the line on the morning of May 6th, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia in this sector was on near collapse. Hill's line had fallen, Longstreet had yet to appear, and the Federals are pushing toward the edge of the field. So sure, desperation. definitely concerned by Lee for what was going to happen. And again, remember, Lee is the hope of the South, of the Confederacy here in Virginia. The soldiers wrote about that prior to the campaign, that they were looking to Lee and the Confederate Army leading them to victory here in Virginia. In the newspapers, immediately after this event occurs, it's picked up in the papers. And this is what editors had to say of Lee putting himself in danger. Peter Alexander, correspondent, May 7th, 1864, just the day after the fighting here, describing Lee, he said, "It was an unnecessary exposure of his life, a life so important and precious to the Confederacy and to all friends of liberty throughout the world." Correspondent for the London Herald said, it has given history a striking proof of the attachment of his troops to his person. The world did not, however, want any evidence of his own devotion, and can hardly fail to pronounce judgment against his course on that occasion as one of rashness. His exposure during the present campaign has been unusual, as to have impressed his troops with profound concern. Against this, Richmond Whig, May 17, 1864, against this we earnestly protest. Too great a cause and too many hopes rest on General Lee's shoulders to admit the exposure of his life. Jackson and Stuart have fallen, Longstreet is disabled, Lee cannot be spared. The Richmond Dispatch, the following day, May 18, 1864, the whole country with one voice should protest against such rash exposure of a life in which we are all so deeply interested, and upon the preservation of which so much depends. There's no doubt the Confederacy viewed Robert E. Lee as the one, their hope for victory, and he could not afford to put himself in danger. And this would not be the last time. Within a week, following this event, on May 10th and then twice on May 12th at Spotsylvania, Robert E. Lee will once again ride into danger, trying to lead his men, in some cases, forward, but certainly urging them and putting himself in danger. Ulysses S. Grant's waging a new kind of war. He's constant pressure against the Confederacy. And perhaps for Lee, it's forcing him to make changes and do things that perhaps he may not have done. And the Confederacy is viewing this, and they know they cannot afford to lose Robert E. Lee. But as the fighting came to a sort of a stalemate in the woods just to the east, as more of Longstreet sent more of his men in, now Lee, having secured Hill's position of earlier in the morning and returned the lines away from the Widow Tapp farm, Lee began, as he was aggressive himself, to look for alternatives, looking at ways to get at that Union force out in front of him. He is going to find something to utilize, or I should say his subordinates are going to find something to utilize. And later that morning, James Longstreet is going to send his troops on a flank march and attack, looking to strike the Union left end of the line. And if you're going to join us for that program, that starts at 9:30. We have a program starting at 9:30 that will be looking at the Longstreet flank attack. It's very special for us because we will be going on private property that we don't normally get to access. For those of you who were on the program last night, it's going to be in essentially the same location. You're parked out on Hilliol Drive here. At 9:30, come down Hilliol Drive, turn left on the plank road. Directly in front of you is the entrance to Fawn Lake, a subdivision, residential subdivision. We will be parking back there in the subdivision. It's a gated community. They know we're coming, but we will be starting there 9:30. Just drive through the gate, and we will be directing you to where we park. So, with that, I hope that you have enjoyed yourself this morning. We hope we see you later on. If you need some of the booklets, the pamphlets with the schedule, they're available at our visitor center tent up at Saunders Field. If you're going to walk back to your cars, please do so by staying on this side of the earthworks until we get to the cut through the works and head on back to the cars. And I want to thank you all for coming out this morning.
Thank you. Great.
Let me take another one. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Take a look. Maybe think try another one.
Probably fine. I do remember.